The curious case of historians who hate history. That's what we're going to be discussing today in a little bit of an off the cuff discussion that's a little bit different from normal podcast episodes. You'll see why, which is appropriate to discuss now. I've been sitting on this for a few months, and I have a couple disclaimers that I want to get into ahead of time before we get into all of the details and all of my haters. Well, at least some of them. Anyway, the first thing is that, of course, should be obvious. I'm only saying what I'm saying. So if I say something like, I think that the historical narrative is important, and I particularly like historical narrative, what I'm not saying is that historians, in order to be historians or even to do history, have to like the historical narrative. That should be obvious, but I just want to make it clear ahead of time. I'm not saying what I'm not I'm not saying what I'm not saying. The second disclaimer is that this video is going to feature prominently a handful of my haters. And I want to make it clear that this is not that I am not in any way, shape, or form asking you to go respond to their comments, to comment on them, to give them any hate whatsoever. This video in and of itself is the totality of response that is required. So please do not comment or harass or in any way bother any of these people who are mentioned. But if you really want to stick it to my haters, you can do two things. One is just make sure that you share this post, share the podcast, like the note that it's on, make sure you repost that, restack it, if you will, repost it. They'll hate that for sure. And also, if you'd like to support me, you can become a paid subscriber on Substack. That would greatly help me to increase the quality and volume of projects that I produce and push the Just Feudal Things and Memory Medieval project further ahead into the future. Normally, I would say it would not be good to mention people directly or call them out without talking to them first, but everybody mentioned here has attempted to slander me directly, acting in bad faith, and never reached out or spoke to me at all. And this is sort of a prequel/lore episode for the actual podcast episode, which is coming out featuring a couple historians and a fellow pop historian/enthusiast about the relationship between historians and enthusiasts and how we can all work together and what our sort of studies and disciplines look like. And I wanted to go into my own views and my own situation here separately because it doesn't have anything to do with any of the historians or my friend in the upcoming episode or any historians who have ever been on the podcast or whoever will be on the podcast. It's a particular situation between myself and the people who were mentioned and their apparent attacks on me and my response to them. First, a little bit about my project so you can understand where I'm coming from in this discussion. The Just Feudal Things podcast is a part of my larger Memory Medieval project. The purpose of this project is, of course, to focus on medieval history, to focus on the narratives, to focus on revitalizing an interest and enthusiasm in medieval history. And of course, as part of that, what really draws me in, what has always drawn me in about the medieval period is the narrative. I've always loved these various stories of heroism, of chivalry, of course, knights. And now that I've gotten into it, more kings and various decisions, the politics, the various different jockeying for power, what people do with that power. And I've also found it particularly illuminating now that I am much more advanced in age and have the experience of politics in modernity to see how politics evolved over the medieval period into the early modern and what we have today, how European history then diverged into America and obviously the northern and southern hemispheres of America, Australia, New Zealand, and various other places. And all of that is very fascinating and particularly illuminating when you study medieval history. Kind of in that vein is also why I have found the Dueling Stories from the 16th Century book so fascinating and great, because it provides a certain frame of understanding the transition from the medieval period into the modern period, if you will, sort of a transition out of knighthood and these various chivalric values into what we might think of as more Enlightenment or Renaissance, Reformation type of values into what we now think of as modern values. All of this is to say, the purpose of what I'm doing primarily is to revitalize an interest and enthusiasm in medieval history, which provides a platform for me to produce historical art. I wanted to do some historical art, and it occurred to me as I started to get into it that I needed to learn a lot more about history. So hopefully this is a platform and a vehicle for me to produce accurate and compelling historical art that goes along with historical narratives in larger form podcasts. That's the ultimate vision. Now, I'm going to be accused of some other things, as you'll see here. And part of the reason why I've sat on this for so long is because I have felt like this criticism of my content, two things. Oftentimes the criticism will validate my position, as you will see, but also it's somewhat of a have you stopped beating your wife type of question. The issue with that type of question is that by answering the question, if you say, I'm just going to explain this for anybody who's not familiar. This is sort of a classic, I believe it's a loaded question fallacy, the fallacy of many questions, if you will. And it's referred to as the loaded question. Have you stopped beating your wife? If you say yes or no, you, by answering the question, you enter into a frame where you essentially agree to the presupposition, which the presupposition is that you were beating your wife. The issue here is that when you get accused of things on the internet, anybody can accuse you of anything for any reason. And the simple accusation, which is part of why they do it, is to put you into this frame of sort of needing to then, you can't just answer the question because or address the issue, in part because the issue then contains these various presuppositions, as you will see, and it attempts to create this sort of gatekeeping away from addressing the actual issues. And you'll see that this is discussed as well in the subsequent podcast roundtable. My view is that history, the practice of history, the doing of history, history itself encompasses many things. It's not just fact finding. It's not just looking at primary sources, but there also is a cultural element to this, the narrative of your culture, the story of your society, the story, in this case, of Europe, and as far as medieval history goes. And so what happens is there is frequently with people who are very critical of me is there's this sort of, I believe it's referred to as the Mott and Bailey, where there's sort of one argument that is made, and then there's always a movement into some other position where they try to correct you. And I'll give you the perfect example here. The technical definition of the Dark Ages, as far as a scholarly definition in academia goes, is some sort of very narrow definition, somewhere between maybe 500 and 800 AD in a very specific part of Western/Northern Europe. And so it encompasses a very particular time, a very particular place. However, you may have also encountered across the internet various memes which go giga viral about, the giant hole in society, left by the quote unquote Christian Dark Ages. And the graph will show 1,000-year period, or these other graphs that show notable scholars. And then there's a huge dip in the graph for an 800-year period or whatever it is. And of course they fudge around the things to show this. Also worth mentioning is that the scholarly definition typically, now as I understand it, refers to a lack of sources. But of course, the colloquial definition refers to everybody was living in the dirt and poop and is covered in mud and wears gray clothes and there's disease everywhere and everybody only lives to 4 years old and they were all backwards and stupid and so on and so forth. So, in order to address this common misperception about the Dark Ages, that it is an entire 1,000-year period, I will post something from 1000 AD or 1200 AD, a church or a chapel, a cathedral or a castle or something, and put quote the Dark Ages. Of course, see, what I'm trying to do is sort of facilitate the understanding that this was not the Dark Ages, obviously, because it doesn't look like something that is backwards and dirty and silly and a regression and these types of things. I'm trying to address it from that perspective and start that discussion. However, of course, I will get various academics or scholarly adjacents in my comments that will say, well, actually, the Dark Ages is a specific time and place, and you're this, that, and the other. Some sort of long-winded explanation about how I am stupid, and as you know, the problem is that if I respond to that and say, well, actually, there are a lot of people who believe this, even with screenshots, there's no answer, or well, you're presenting misinformation. The point is that it's always sort of a back and forth about these things where there's a talking past one another in that the the person who is critical, and that's the other thing too, is the purpose of this. I guess I should interject and say the purpose of this is not to denigrate academia or scholars. The podcast episode features two great medieval scholars, two great medieval academics and historians, and how we can work together. And that's, of course, a big focus of the podcast in total. Most of my episodes are with academics and with scholars and promoting their excellent work. So the point of this isn't that academia is bad or that scholars are bad, although most of my haters are these sort of academics and scholars for these reasons. And I am going to propose that the reason that it is it's because they hate the historical narrative. In short, they hate history. And this is sort of where the back and forth, this sort of Mott and Bailey comes from, where if you talk about history in a particular way, they will use sort of their credentials or expertise or, just sticking to the facts as a way to sort of deconstruct the historical narrative. However, the historical narrative is important because the way that you think about yourself is going to determine how you act. And in the same way that I'm not trying to unjustifiably glaze things that shouldn't be glazed, I'm also not trying to denigrate or condemn things that shouldn't be condemned. And I'll give you a very easy example, which is feudalism. Of course, given our modern sensibilities and our modern time, feudalism is not something that we're going to go back to. And it's not something that may work right now. That's not something that I talk about or care to explore. However, feudalism in the past is often condemned as slavery, which it is not. I have a podcast episode on that. Or it's basically looked down upon as this backward system, which it is my view that it is actually an upgrade from the previous slavery type systems. The issue with something like feudalism is that you have to look at it in contrast to other things that evolved in its time. In the year 1000, everyone's not going to have sort of middle management laptop jobs. So, what are the reasonable alternatives that also existed at the time that you would measure that against? And I suppose maybe this gets into a third disclaimer about this, is that these are my opinions and these are not the opinions of anybody who speaks with me. And likewise, anybody who speaks with me, I don't necessarily agree with their opinions. I've had several guests in the podcast who We don't discuss politics because it doesn't come up, because it's not pertinent to us talking about their expertise in medieval history. But I can imagine that I would disagree with some of their politics, and they would certainly disagree with some of mine. In fact, it's probably safe to assume that every guest on the podcast would disagree with some of my politics, and I would disagree with some of theirs, because everybody has different opinions about everything. But that doesn't mean that we can't talk to each other or talk about facts in medieval history together or explore history together. It is my position that, which I also said this on David Lescalite IV's podcast. He was generous to have me on. And I think that there is a certain, and for this aspect, I certainly don't assign any maliciousness to people. It's free money. Talking badly about the past is free money. If you want to justify, quote unquote, things in the present, the easiest justification that you can have for anything in the present is to talk badly about somebody or something in the past, which then automatically positions, in terms of the framing, your current thing, idea, political project, technology, whatever it is, as being an improvement on something in the past. And so, to be clear, I'm not ascribing malicious intent to that automatically. It's free money. If you have something, if I was working in an AI company right now and somebody said, oh, this technology seems dystopian, a very easy answer for me is to say, what do you want to do? Go back to feudalism? What do you want to do? Go back to medieval medicine? It's free money. You can just say that stuff. And what are they going to do? Go research what medicine was actually like in medieval Europe? What are they going to do? Go research what feudalism was actually like, put it into context, come up with an argument. It's totally free money to justify anything in the present by maligning something in the past. So I think that there is some element of that also that is happening here, that people view what's happening in the present as justifiable, and they can prove that by denigrating or deconstructing the past. And so there are some people who are, of course, not doing that with any sort of malicious intent. And there are people who do it. I don't know, I'm not making a claim on which ones are which, but I think that it does happen both ways. Ultimately, it boils down to the fact that the story of Western civilization, the narrative, is important and it does matter. And that if you are going to do history, you don't have to like it, but you should respect it in that context. And I suppose this is a great time for me to mention the fourth disclaimer, that I am not a historian, professionally trained. I don't even consider myself to be a pop historian per se. I think of myself as an enthusiast, and I bill myself that way just to make it clear to anybody who is looking at my content that I'm not trying to represent myself as somebody, who is a trained professional who then is expected to have read every source and that sort of thing. Of course, I feel a strong responsibility to the sources, and I do want to be as factual as possible. So I am not trying to push a narrative that is not factual, but I am trying to explore narratives that are respectful, and even criticisms should be respectful in that context. This is not to say that you can't have criticisms or that we shouldn't look at how things really were. It's just that we should look at them in a respectful kind of way that maintains a healthy integrity of our cultural story. If we think of ourselves as bad, then we will begin to act negatively. It's really that simple. I have young sons. I want them to think of themselves positively. So, of course, part of my project is to portray our culture and heritage in a positive way and to speak about virtues that I would like them to consider and integrate into their own personalities and characters. Heroism and courage and thoughtfulness, noblesse oblige, self-sacrifice, those types of things. I want them to consider and be exposed to those types of things. So all of that said, so originally what has spawned the subsequent podcast episode is I would call it a hit piece written on me by an Oxford PhD student, of which I have discovered there's a little clique of them on Substack, and sort of has caused a ripple into various other people. And so I am going to get into these criticisms and their things now so we can talk about what they had to say about me and my content, with, again, the reminder to please do not go harass or comment or say anything to these people that I consider this response to be adequate in its entirety. The first one that I'll get to is a gentleman on Substack, Jon Dell Isola, PhD. He recently graduated with a PhD in medieval history, some form of medieval history around the Carolingian period. I'm not sure exactly. I actually commented on some of his stuff to say that your PhD sounds interesting and relevant. I'd be happy to have you on the podcast. And he didn't respond. So I suppose if you're listening, John, the offer is rescinded. But in fact, I've had another PhD student on the podcast just a couple episodes ago talking about the War of the Roses. And I think it's good to have people on who are doing interesting research, even if they're not well known or can help the podcast in any way other than coming on and talking about their expertise. Because I think it's good to boost people that are doing good research and interesting stuff. And I want to see what is stuff that is being current. But anyway, John reposted the hit piece on me with the following comment. This is getting at something you see a lot on Substack and Twitter, a glorified return, in air quotes, mentality toward the Middle Ages or classical world that is concealing the real nuances of the period. It seeks to create an idealized vision of a simpler, quote unquote, time to contrast with the corrupt modern. As usual, the medieval functions as a foil for the modern, often correlated with right-wing ideas around religion and social norms. It isn't a neutral presentation. So I will mention it here. I'm not a returner. However, of course, we do need to understand where things have been in order to take things that are useful from the past and fuse them with where we are now into the future. So we're not going back. We're not going back to feudalism. Just want to put that out there. Hope that's helpful, John. I did respond to his comment and saying that I have posted publicly about not being a returner, but do think we should take good things and use them as inspiration to move forward, not unlike Charlemagne with the Romans. Not that I am like Charlemagne, but I think we should emulate his approach. He did not like or respond to that comment. I also want to say at this point, I'm going to discuss several of these haters, if you will. None of them, zero of them, ever reached out to me or even made any attempt to discuss anything with me. They only thought to talk about me in an oblique way, as if I was not in the room, in a negative way, obviously. With Holly's comment on my post being the exception, I suppose, that we'll get to. So I guess thanks, Holly. And so that's part of the reason why I think that they're operating in bad faith and why they deserve this sort of response, because none of them reached out to talk to me, even to say like, hey, what is this about? What's your approach? Technically this is wrong or anything like that. None of that. They simply just sought to slander me in public. So anyway, that was John's take. He thinks that I'm trying to create an idealized vision of simpler times. Although I read primary sources and discuss them quite frequently and have historians on my podcast, so that's a pretty strange criticism from somebody who could look at my content for 2 seconds and just assume that I'm doing all of these types of things. However, for John, it's not a neutral presentation, but Neither is John's presentation. That's sort of one of the things that you will find also commonly on a lot of these types of critiques is the veil of neutrality or no bias, when in fact their bias is just the opposite of what they're accusing me of. So, um, B for effort, I suppose. I should, of course, also mention here that I am not above criticism, and I appreciate being corrected when I am wrong. I issue corrections. I make edits to correct things. I'm happy to be corrected when I'm factually wrong. I don't believe that these criticisms really have much to do with being factually wrong, as opposed to, as you see and will see, goofy accusations such as the impression of a simpler time. That's not really a factual correction. So I welcome correction. If I'm ever wrong, please don't take this as my not wanting to be corrected. I absolutely do want to be corrected, and I'm very thankful for the times that I have been factually corrected and encourage anyone to do so anytime they catch me in a misstep, because it is, of course, an accident. The next comment about me is from somebody named Ben Loomis. I don't know who Ben Loomis is. It's not exactly clear on his Substack what he's doing, although he says he's doing history as a philosophical practice. So whatever philosophy he must espouse, he sees it as antagonistic to mine, of enjoying Western civilization and appreciating our culture and heritage. So I had a viral post, which is what spawned all of this, and we'll get to the hit piece at the end because it's the biggest piece, about how, so the viral post was a picture of the St. Chapelle Chapel, and the caption in its entirety was, "The people who built this weren't motivated by profits." The idea behind this post, the idea here is to get people thinking outside of a materialist view. When you think about people in the past, in the medieval period, they are often cartoonized as being these sort of cardboard cutout, cynical Machiavellians, because the modern mind has a very hard time sort of getting outside of this materialist frame. The idea here being that posting something beautiful like this that everybody likes and appreciates with that sort of caption that they didn't build this with profit in mind, the idea is to get out of viewing these people as cynical materialists, which of course I get plenty of comments about how, well, actually, the chapels were designed to make them money and show their power, and they were built by slaves, and all of these types of comments. But ultimately, the idea here is to get the person who is scrolling through and reading this to think about medieval history in a non-materialist way, which is what has spawned the unhappiness of many people, including Ben here, who says, "The people who built this weren't motivated by profit, but that's primarily because the modern notion of profit, defined as surplus to capital and labor and made possible by things like double entry bookkeeping, financial instruments, etc., didn't exist in the 13th century." So the post would be correct then, wouldn't it be? When the Sainte Chapelle, the building shown here, was constructed. So the post is correct, but let's be clear. Many of the people who built this were indeed motivated by money, others by piety. Louis IX, who commissioned the chapel, was later canonized. Okay, so the post is correct because it was built by Louis IX and he was canonized. So what are we talking about here? Anyway, others by piety or by competition, pride, or guild obligations, most likely had a mixture of motivations. So when you see accounts posting disingenuous one-liners with unattributed images, this is another constant sort of gatekeeping critique. Your images are unattributed. I mean, welcome to the internet. I try to post credit for artwork when I use it, and but with the volume of content that I post, and the way images circulate on the internet, like you can't look up every photo, and every photo doesn't have an attribution when you get it. Anyway, that's of course irrelevant. It's just one of those things that they toss in there to make you seem like somebody who doesn't care. I'm an artist, Ben. Okay. Of course I care about attribution. I care about people acknowledging other people's artwork. So anyway, the point of it is that they're just, it's just a poisoning the well type of tactic, which I appreciate at least that he wrote almost 3 paragraphs above that to say that the post was correct before he decided to just slander me. So when you see accounts posting disingenuous one-liners with unattributed images, the people who built this weren't motivated by profits, or these weren't the Dark Ages, and no serious historian ever called the 13th century that, don't follow them. And if you are following them, stop. They're peddling ignorant certainty, and giving their pablum your attention makes you a little dumber. Virtually nothing in history or in life can be reduced to a single sentence. True understanding requires nuance, context, complexity, and a willingness to think past slogans. But does it require messaging somebody to speak to them for 2 seconds before slandering them? No, it does not. There are no shortcuts. With a photo of Saint Chapelle, taken by me, as always, taken November 2024. I mean, what can you say? It's just goofy. He basically said that the post was correct. He just doesn't like my approach, or again, thinks that some, whatever is his aim in history, it's not to respect and appreciate and get people to think a little bit differently in a positive way about medieval history. What can you say? He must just hate history. I don't know. That's all I can come up with. I don't know what exactly he's doing here. What is he doing? I don't know. Anyway, so I had another post, which it was a painting of the Lincoln Cathedral, which was built shortly after the Norman Conquest in 1066. And it was a painting of that. And it looked to me, when I got the painting, that it was a painting of the medieval period. As it turns out, it was a painting, I believe, in the 17th century. Anyway, the painting was a 17th century representation, 17th or 18th century, although it looks very medieval. So, of course, I posted it with the aforementioned trademarked the Dark Ages, because it appears to be that sort of thing, but it, of course, does not look dirty or disgusting. And so our next contestant of my haters is an Oxford PhD student, helping curious readers connect the dots of early medieval England, Holly A. Brown on Substack. And she also commented a more polite response, but she restacked it herself and commented, "Can we please stop mischaracterizing the so-called Dark Ages just to make a point? The Dark Ages is generally considered to refer to the period roughly after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, 5th century, and before 1000 AD. This first image is of a much, much later time, and while it is right to question, and at times deconstruct the historiographical models we've inherited, perpetuating misinformation in pursuit of that goal is not okay." This is sort of just standard gatekeeping, trying to basically pile on in an oblique way as to say that this person is perpetuating misinformation because their technical definitions are wrong, and therefore they, trying to catch you on that technical gotcha. You didn't attribute your image properly. But the perpetuating misinformation is a deliberate and technical term that they, of course, know what they're doing. We've heard a lot of political talk in the last 5-8 years on the internet about misinformation. And so that's a very deliberate attempt to characterize what I'm doing in a particular way. And as I must say, as I said before, she never reached out and talked to me. She doesn't know anything about me, which, as the other person the other lady who wrote the hit piece on me said, she doesn't know any of my content or whatever. They just go out of their way. They sort of can tell when they see something that this does not align with the way that I dislike history, and therefore I must gatekeep it. And look, to be honest, if you're a scholar and you have those credentials, the easiest way to gatekeep something you don't like is to use your credentials as an attempt to body somebody. I can't argue with the technique. It's, of course, a very obvious one, in the same way that slandering the past is a very obvious and easy way to justify the present. So, I can't argue with that, the necessity of that. But I would say if you liked history and wanted to have an appreciation of history, it's a really strange way to go about that by slandering people who are trying to get an enthusiasm and positive appreciation for medieval history. It's a strange approach, which I cannot understand and can only imply is being done in bad. Lastly, we'll get to this hit piece that was written about my post and me by the Empress of Byzantium, who is Madeleine, a DPhil, which is what they call a PhD student at Oxford. She says, the people who built this were motivated by profits. And you'll have a link to these in the post below if you want to read them. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I would like to touch upon a couple key points that she talks about in her article about me and my post. The people who built this were motivated by profits. Maybe it's not that deep, but I believe that medieval historical misinformation needs to be called out. And then she goes on to talk about the image. And we get a couple paragraphs down. She posts an image of the post with obviously me cut out, to which she says, the note in question. I will say, if the original poster sees this, I hope you don't find it too annoying that I have not given your image proper attribution. It's partly to stop further piling on in the comment section, but also to make a point that it is really annoying for any creator to use unattributed images. I will point out, people only care about the use of unattributed images with people who they disagree with on something else, because it's obviously just nonsense gatekeeping. Here, and then she gets to this paragraph. Despite my sassiness over the lack of proper image attribution, the purpose of this piece isn't to either drag nor laud and promote the original poster. The purpose here is not to drag me. Partly what I've obscured, partly why I've obscured the name of the account. Although the statement they offer is inaccurate. Well, not according to Ben, but they never hashed it out. And whilst they seem pretty recalcitrant about their views in the comments section, I don't actually believe that the post itself on its own was made in bad faith. That's a very specific descriptor. However, it comes with a footnote. There is a footnote here. I get the sense that the original poster operates under a specific mode or paradigm of medieval studies, which is not only outdated and largely misguided, but which is often laced with far-right ideology and rhetoric. I do not know the poster personally and will not be making an assessment of anything to do with their politics, even though I've just called them a Nazi, but not really, but also I have. But I think it's worth noting that although I believe the post was not made in bad faith, I'm just a bystander. These tendencies may exist, I do not personally seek to engage with or practice the aforementioned mode of history. This is really the operative part here behind all of this. The art of calling somebody a Nazi without calling them a Nazi, but also definitely calling them a Nazi. What can you say? Have you stopped beating your wife? And I think I would have been fine with letting all of the rest of these comments slide and just ignoring them. But when they all roll up into falsely accusing you of being a Nazi, then it feels like something that you have to address, which is really quite something for somebody to read one post that's one sentence long. And apparently she looked through the comments, my responses to people in the comments as well, and then decide that this person is a Nazi, basically. And that's really where, of course, all of the bad faith of these arguments comes in, because if somebody thought that and was concerned about it legitimately, then they would reach out to you and speak to you before just directly accusing you of something like that. This is why I can only assume that these people hate history, because there is no good faith attempt to work with somebody such as myself, despite whatever disagreements we may have on various opinions about other things. The idea of needing to control what comes out here about history, and not even, keep in mind, I'm not saying things that are factually wrong. I'm not saying things that are, purposefully misleading or anything like that. I'm saying things that are positive, trying to get people to think about things in a different way, trying to stoke enthusiasm and interest. And the response from this is, that person is definitely a Nazi. Not really, but definitely. How else are you supposed to interpret this? She goes on, I think the issue with the post is that it does reflect some common misconceptions that arise when we think about pre-modern societies, as well as their artistic production and consumption habits. It also has some outdated historiographical principles inherently imbued within it, which are worth addressing. She's talking about the one sentence post, by the way. As such, I want to take the opportunity to run through some of these issues, thinking about the ways that our modern capitalistic thought paradigms come into troubling contact with the past, and how to begin correcting our assumptions. In doing so, we can lay the groundwork for better interpretations of historical works of art and the motivations of their creators. Even more importantly, I think it is a chance to consider how we can use proper engagement with these works of art to understand their place in the systems they were created in, and thus treat the men and women responsible for their creation more fairly and accurately. Now, I don't have any real issue with that last paragraph on the face of it. Of course, we want to be factual. We want to give people credit. We want to uh, be correct. Of course, you want to be correct. But what's going to happen in the same way as calling me a Nazi without calling me a Nazi just happened? We're going to deconstruct the historical narrative because we don't like it, disguised as being fair and accurate to the historical narrative. It's like a Russian nesting doll, underneath, we're gonna at every level, we're going to say we're not doing something that we're doing, and then you plop it open, and then we're going to say we're not doing something that we're doing, and you plop it open, and we're going to say we're not doing something that we're doing. From what I can gather, based on the original note as well as from the comment section, the original poster believes that the Sainte Chapelle, in all its glory, was a building motivated solely, she puts this in italics, solely by religious concerns. Well, they are correct. My position would be that it was primarily built, not solely, primarily. That means there are other motivations, but the primary motivation was religious, or Louis IX's pious motivations. Again, she wrote this whole piece without talking to me or asking me or saying anything. Just nothing. Just, you know, Here's what I can gather. This person is a Nazi. Here's what they think. It is simply historically inaccurate to state that this was the sole reason that the Sainte Chapelle was constructed. Let's start with where the statement could be framed as accurate. The Sainte Chapelle was indeed commissioned and built in the reign of King Louis IX of France to house some of Christianity's most important relics, the crown of thorns and a fragment of the true cross. Louis IX had acquired these from Baldwin II. I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to recount more than the most basic of facts. 13th century France was a module I particularly hated as an undergraduate. Essentially, by solely attributing motivation for the Sainte Chapelle's construction to religion, the original poster fails to recognize that most medieval European societies did not distinguish between statecraft, religion, and profit-generating enterprises in the same way that we might today. The Sainte Chapelle may have been built with the intention of housing important religious relics, but it was not this intention alone which necessitated its construction. No shit. Really? The building could operate as both a house for religious devotion and a testament to Louis IX's extraordinary wealth and power. Obviously. Both of which would have been read as signs in the medieval period of Louis's immense devotion. The three ideas existed in a tripart harmony, each one justifying and strengthening the other. I had to read this multiple times to get these three ideas existing in a tripart harmony. The three things that she mentions are: it could operate as a house for religious devotion, a testament to Louis IX's extraordinary wealth and power, and both of which would have been read as signs of Louis's immense devotion. For those of you keeping track at home, that's 2 times 2 of the 3 of the tripart harmony, which are his religious devotion, his piety, his, as we might think of it, non-materialist views. And the 1/3 of these in the tripart harmony is his wealth and power. Now, I went to art school, so I'm no mathematician, but if 2 of 3 of something are basically the same, could you say that that thing encompasses the primary motivation, that it encompasses the lion's share of motivation? In short, Louis IX was pious because he was rich, and Louis IX was rich because he was pious. Now, that wasn't where I was going to go with that. But apparently her view is that people were pious because they could afford to be. And they could afford to be because they were pious. And this is back to the article, and being both pious and rich meant that Louis IX was a very good king who deserved to be rewarded with even more proclamations of piety and sanctity, as well as material wealth. You came this close. Almost had it. She was right there. The whole point of this, the whole point of the post, was to get people to think of people in the medieval period as somebody who's not strictly materialistic, who's not, driven sort of by cynical Machiavellianism or in a very materialistic mind as we would think of them today, as we think of people behaving today. And she went right up to the line. And then actually, he's pious because he's rich, which is why he's rich, because he's pious. I should also mention that this serves as another one of those Mott and Bailey shifting goalposts arguments. If you say that, or if you assert, if you theorize, if you hypothesize that somebody in the medieval period was sincere, the counter to that is then to, of course, bring up some sort of materialist, Machiavellian, cynical motivation, which, let's be honest, even for my own sake, I very much appreciate the pragmatism of people in the medieval period. They had to be pragmatic. Life and death was much more a focus, and consequences, actions had a much more direct route to consequences than they do for most people in modernity. But that does not mean that they cannot also be sincere, which is the point of the post. Yes, of course, Louis was motivated by practical concerns. Of course, they all were. It's literally a hallmark of the time period that they are extremely pragmatic, but they can also be sincere. And in fact, the motivation for building the Sainte Chapelle can be, as she even says, more primarily driven by his sincerity in his religious beliefs, in believing in God, and believing in Jesus, in being a Christian. So, like, what are we talking about here? This is, again, this is more of like, what we need to do is be fair and accurate. But actually, what we are going to do is try to like obfuscate and deconstruct and actually not be more accurate about the whole thing. And then she goes on with an example of Justinian, who built the Hagia Sophia, one of the most spectacular monuments to Christianity and the Orthodox Church still surviving today. It was built to be the central church of Constantinople, to be an anchor for liturgy and invite the Holy Spirit during Eucharist, and to demonstrate the utmost devotion of Justinian to Christ and God. At the same time, it is also a demonstration of incredible wealth. The ability to employ and pay thousands upon thousands of workers was also a central piece in the elaborate ceremonials of later Byzantine emperors, indicative of their enormous political power, which could only ever be justified by the deep piety expressed in their connection to such a holy place. Of course, this maybe can be the fifth disclaimer, that not everybody in the medieval period was wealthy enough to build a castle or a cathedral or the Hagia Sophia. Peasants were not building gigantic monuments as testaments of their piety. Just to make it clear to everybody, I'm not a historian. I can't say that for sure. I haven't read every primary source on the medieval period, but I do feel comfortable generally in expressing the hypothetical assessment that peasants and serfs, basic farmers, and even in the outlying areas, slaves did not build giant stone cathedrals that required these types of things, because they did not have the power and money and prestige in order to build them. Which, when you have the power and the money and prestige, then it means that you have, apparently, according to this article, the luxury to be pious. Therefore, we can conclude peasants were not pious. You can see how it's always this sort of moving goalpost. It's a moving goalpost type of situation where they will say one thing, but then use a technical definition to deconstruct it, and then try to bring it back around to, well, of course, we're just trying to be fair and accurate here. But the point is that it's wrong in every case. It's actually not, just like her example with Louis. Her whole point is like, well, I'm gonna make a misstatement that it's solely for religious intent, and then we're going to show how his primary motive was for religious intent, but not all of them, and so therefore we can just conclude that it's all wrong. She, moving on, the story of how Louis IX's relics came to be acquired through the paying off of another ruler's debts is a story of how religion could disguise and support political intrigue and economic profit. The whole point of this is to muddy the waters. It is not, in fact, to get clarity, because then she would just be simple and direct in the way that she deals with Louis and his history. She's going to use this story to explain how actually Louis IX's piety is a disguise for his Machiavellianism, as she just says shortly after that. Certainly, Louis IX's piety drove him to want to acquire the relics, but in doing so, he was able to demonstrate his significant financial leverage and power to another ruler, both of their courts and the Catholic Church. Anyway, what's really important, what she says here a few paragraphs down, what is really important to understand about all of this is that the idea that we can separate out religion from profit or politics is very modern. It is an idea defined by post-Enlightenment thought paradigms which insist on the separation of church and state as the crucial linchpin for a modern and westernized and therefore functioning civil society, however rare it is that such a situation truly arises. Now, I do think that this is actually part of the point that I've been trying to make, that we can't think about the past in the same way that we think about the present. That was the whole point of the post. However, the point has been made, and I make the point quite frequently, actually, with another excerpt from a book that I like to reference quite often. And I suppose I should also add that you can make this point. I actually welcome any academics or scholars, anybody who knows more than me, which is a lot of people. I welcome anybody to add context to my posts, to post below them, to add other things, to cite sources, and to enhance the factualness of my posting. I even say this regularly. I'm happy for people to do that. I appreciate it. I want to learn more. And I, of course, want to be accurate and factual. A person on X quite nicely did this on a post, and it's a passage from The Waning of the Middle Ages by Johann Huizinga. And she just posted, he also discusses how the piety of medieval nobles was sincere, but it is also so inconceivable to the modern mind that people often dismiss it as hypocrisy. And I'll read you this little passage because I think it's just phenomenal. It's really an incredible thing to consider, which is even thinking about this and talking about this on X is how I ended up posting that bit again, the original post that caused up the stir. From the book. Among the princes and lords of the 15th century, more than one presents the type of an almost inconceivable mixture of devotion and debauchery. Louis of Orleans, brother of the French king, an insane lover of luxury and pleasure, addicted even to the sin of necromancy, has his cell in the common dormitory of the Celestines, where he shares the privations and duties of monastic life, rising at midnight and sometimes hearing 5 or 6 masses a day. The coexistence in one person of devotion and worldliness is displayed in a striking fashion in Philip the Good. The Duke, famous for his Molt Belle campaign of bastards, his extravagant feasts, his grasping policy, and for a pride not less violent than his temper, is at the same time strictly devout. He was in the habit of remaining in his oratory for a long time after Mass, and living on bread and water 4 days a week, as well as on all the vigils of Our Lady and the Apostles. He is often still fasting at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He gives alms on a great scale and in secret. After the surprise of Luxembourg, he remains engrossed in his hours and special prayers of thanksgiving so long that his escort, awaiting him on horseback, grow impatient, for the fight was not yet quite over. On being warned of the danger, the Duke replies, "If God has granted me victory, he will keep it for me." Medieval nobles and princes represent so many different types of very worldly and often frivolous temperament, coupled with a devotional spirit which one shrinks from stigmatizing as hypocrisy or bigotry. It has rather to be regarded as a kind of reconciliation, hardly conceivable to the modern mind, between two moral extremes. And throughout this article, you can see her sort of wrestling with this idea and trying to figure out not how to present it in the way that Huizinga does in his book as a way of being respectful to the subject matter and approaching it with some sort of sincerity yourself, but as a way of actually deconstructing it, of making it seem cynical without making it cynical, but it's still cynical. And then, of course, she starts talking about the anonymous workers, how my post is somehow leaving workers out of the story. When somebody buys land and then pays a general contractor to build a house on that land, and then they go live in the house, and people come over and they say, wow, this is a great house. The person does not say, yes, well, we purchased the land and then we hired a general contractor who then he hired some subcontractors who came out and dug the foundation, and those subcontractors did a great job with the basement, and then we hired out some other subcontractors. The general contractor hired out other subcontractors who did the flooring and the electrical and the plumbing, and then the general contractor supervised the building of the house, which was done by all of the laborers. Nobody says that. They say, yeah, it's a nice house. Thank you. We built this house. We built our dream house. We built the house. The person who pays for it to be done is, in normal parlance, credited as the builder. So the Post is in no way trying to say anything. Again, the disclaimer about how I'm not saying things that I'm not saying. The Post is not saying anything about the builders. And in fact, the Post is not trying to say anything by not saying anything about the builders. It's one sentence. It's a social media post. I can't go into a dissertation on every social media post. Anyway, she goes into how the people whose minds and bodies actually brought the building to life, they were as much motivated by the varying nuanced shades of their genuine piety as they were by profit. Now, to her credit, she does address the people in the comments saying that the chapel was built by slaves. And she does go into this idea that slavery was incorrect. A wise move on her part to give herself some credibility by being accurate. Then she starts getting into this argument about feudalism, which, again, she never spoke to me about, and I suppose we'll get to that in a second. Another issue that she finds especially egregious is that the statement only further anonymizes the artisans ultimately responsible for the Sainte-Chapelle's construction. Okay. The points that she's raising in the second part of the article is more of the muddying the waters, as much as she can sort of make up something that I'm saying and then refute it with some sort of historical fact, is a way of further demonstrating ways in which I am wrong and promoting misinformation and cannot be trusted. And as Ben said, you should not follow me. And I discovered while editing this that somebody named M.E. Rothwell had tagged her on Ben's post that we discussed. And Madeleine responded to the tag and said, couldn't have said it better myself, TBH, to be honest. So I guess her and Ben are never going to hash that out. Just because the craftspeople working on the Sainte-Chapelle are anonymous to us does not mean that we need to willingly participate in their generalization or erasure. Forcing medieval craftspeople to be a faceless, anonymous, almost dehumanized group of workers with no desire nor requirement of economic compensation is to do these real people a grave disservice. She's just being silly. This is just, nobody said that. And then she goes into how the Post is reinforcing in its own way a version of the starving artist stereotype. This model of artistic practice separates the work of the artist from the economic systems that they operate within. I'm not going to go into this. This is so stupid. I'm an artist. I think artists should get paid. This is just nonsense. The Post didn't say that. The Post didn't imply that. Again, she has to spiral into these tangents to build this sort of catalog of errors that I've committed in order to show how uncredible of a person I am. And as a person who is so dastardly and uncredible, I mean, I basically have erased all of the craftsmen from medieval history. I have perpetuated the starving artist stereotype. I've, on and on and on, this sort of, cascading catalog of all of these factual errors and things that you can basically deduce that I'm a Nazi. Even though I'm not a Nazi, it's just that when people say this stuff, oftentimes it's laced with being a Nazi. Therefore, you can conclude with the giant compendium of evidence presented here that I obviously am a Nazi, but not really, but also yes. Anyway, she finishes up here, the last two paragraphs. That incomplete picture can then be manipulated for dishonest or nefarious purposes, relying on the wider public's lack of knowledge about the specificities of historiographical debates to promote an incorrect, dehistoricized, and sanitized version of the past. All of this is to say what I am sure is quite self-evident to any God student of history. Yes, it says God student. This is a PhD student at Oxford who, whatever, I don't need to go in, whatever. Medieval artisans were motivated by profit, as were pretty much all other medieval people. As were pretty much all other medieval people. See, this is how we're going to go into Louis' piety, but actually he wasn't pious. And art is never created in a vacuum. Allowing narratives such as this one to be circulated on social media will only stand to increase historical misinformation and perpetuate at best outdated and at worst dangerous. You heard that correctly, dangerous interpretations of the past. And the article is linked below. You can go read it if you want. Again, please no comments. Don't say anything. And of course, you'll see Holly Brown in the comments. Thank you for this detailed, considered, and highly informative response. I particularly appreciate your points about stripping medieval craftspeople of their agency. So important to remember their backgrounds, contexts, and reasons for working. My favorite comment, though, was by this person. Journeys through medievalism. I feel like the original poster is my distant substack nemesis that I choose not to engage with. Instead, I quietly stalk around in the shadows, drawing conspiracy boards to refute each post, silently seething each time I see their calls to return to a glorious past. Like all nemesis relationships, I feel quite possessive about this one, but this post is really very excellent and far more measured and well-researched any of the screeds I'd come out with. All that to say, you're doing God's work, and I thank you for stopping me from embarrassing myself in a semi-public forum. Anyway, now that we've sort of gone through this and you've gotten to experience at least secondhand what it's like to be called dangerous, somebody provoking misinformation, a returner, somebody who is, well, they're not far right, but the things that they say are often laced with far right viewpoints and said by people who are far right. I can't attribute that motive to them. I don't know them, but people who are like that do say those things once in a while, sometimes, or all the time. So you can basically infer what I'm trying to get you to infer here about this person. But I will not say that myself because I believe that they're just a genuine person who's normal and not a Nazi, but also a Nazi. Anyway, ultimately, the point of all of this, now that you can enjoy at least vicariously all of the ways in which I have been slandered, you would think, and I would think, that historians would appreciate. And as you will see in the next podcast episode coming up here right after this one, you would think that historians would want people out there who are essentially behaving as marketing departments for history. You would think that they would like that. But if you were not a historian, or if you hated history, then perhaps you may not enjoy that so much. And in fact, that may come across as misinformation. In fact, that may be dangerous. And so I can only leave it up to you, the listener, those of you who have come this far. Of course, it is at this point I must ask for your support. If you are feeling generous and have the resources, upgrading to a paid subscription on Substack helps me quite a bit and will help me to continue not only to do the projects that I'm doing, but to do bigger and better projects and to get more people excited and interested in medieval history and to bring you, of course, more great medieval history, including from primary sources, which I read quite frequently. And also be sure to restack the note that this podcast is posted on so that way more people can see it. Because I think we'd all agree that would be a good thing. I can only leave it up to you, the listener, to decide, do these historians actually hate history? Because it seems to me like they do, but, that's just my opinion. And I suppose you will have to form your own. On that note, you will not want to miss the next episode where I have two historians and a fellow enthusiast / pop historian on to discuss the controversy between historians and quote unquote non-historians and how we can all work better together and do much more better history together.